In this lecture, I'll be talking about what role the sciences play in society and what role we think the sciences ought to play in society. And one of the big questions about involving science and its role in society is what values, if any, should guide a scientist? What's the relationship between values and questions of value and science? And there's 4 different questions, I think, that are relevant to this broader question. 1, should values constrain the conduct of research? Can science help us decide what we ought to do, morally speaking? Are there any values assumed by the overall enterprise of science? And does a scientist have a responsibility to consider possible applications of her research? So to take the first question, should values constrain the conduct of research? Now, I think that there's a fair amount of consensus these days that there's at least some cases of scientific experimentation that were simply morally wrong. So the most famous example is probably Nazi physician Joseph Mengele, who I think famously did some pretty terrible sadistic experiments on concentration camp victims during World War II. Another famous example of a scientific experiment that seems to us now to be pretty clearly unethical, pretty clearly contrary to values I think most of us hold, was the Tuskegee syphilis study. If you haven't heard of this study, this was a decades-long study on the natural progression of syphilis. And what happened was this was a historical study that followed the progress of the disease in a number of predominantly poor African American men in the South from the early part of the 1900s into the early 70s. And all of these men had syphilis, but the researchers essentially didn't tell them they had syphilis, and because they wanted to follow the natural progression of the disease. And syphilis, if left untreated, causes any number of terrible effects, organ failure, it causes mental illness and insanity, and it eventually will kill you. And all of these men involved in this study weren't told that they had syphilis because the scientists wanted to follow the progression of the disease. Crucially, they weren't even told that they had syphilis when in the late 30s an effective treatment for syphilis was found in terms of penicillin. They weren't, so all of these men could have been treated and had and been much healthier, but in order to study the progression of the disease, they not only weren't treated, they were deceived. They weren't told that they had syphilis, and in some cases, the scientists behind the study even actively sought to prevent these men from seeking treatment elsewhere, so that they could remain in the study and they could follow the progression of the disease. So you've got Mengele in the concentration camp. You've got the Tuskegee syphilis study. These are cases in which scientists in the service of science did pretty clearly terrible, immoral things. And I think it's hard to look at examples like this and say that and conclude that values ought never constrain research. It does seem to be the case that there's certain kinds of experiments that are just wrong to do, that you can't ethically do. Certainly there's a lot of human experimentation that might be very effective at gleaning important knowledge or gleaning important experimental results that we can't do for ethical reasons. Similarly, and then also an issue that's been increasingly debated in recent years is just what's ethical, what kinds of experiments are ethical on animals, which is of course far more controversial. But in the current practice of science, it's now broadly accepted that There's certain kinds of experimentation that, for moral reasons, can't be carried out. And there are institutional review boards, if you've ever heard that term. There's institutions in place to ensure that, that are supposed to ensure anyway, that if an experiment is carried out, it's carried out within certain kinds of moral guidelines. So that's one sense in which values certainly are understood in science as it's practiced now to be relevant and important and something that a scientist needs to consider. Now, another question is another question about values in science is the question of, can science actually help us make judgments of value? Does science have any role to play in helping us to decide what the right or wrong thing to do is, or how we should evaluate the rightness or wrongness of some action? And here I think it's enormously helpful to look at a distinction made by philosopher of science Carl Hempel between what he called categorical value and instrumental value. Now, categorical value are general moral values, basic moral principles, like it's wrong to murder or it's good to help other people. And categorical values, Hempel suggests, aren't the sort of thing that science can provide us. They're not the sort of thing that any kind of scientific experimentation can help us find. Science is descriptive, and it just can't be used to derive basic moral principles. However, science does have a role to play, Hempel argued, in helping us to make value judgments. And the role it has to play is in helping us determine the instrumental value of certain kinds of actions or of certain kinds of practices. That is, science can help us to understand how to reach goals that are informed by our categorical values. And Hempel has an interesting example of how he thinks that this distinction can play out. So Hempel suggests that most of us probably, as a categorical value, want our children to be happy and well-adjusted and productive. Okay? And he says that, look, there's no scientific experimentation that can, if you've got someone who doesn't think that we ought to want our children to be happy and well-adjusted and productive, there's probably no scientific experiment that you can do to change that person's mind. It's not the sort of thing, it's not a descriptive fact. It's what philosophers sometimes call a prescriptive fact. It's an ought claim, not an is claim. However, this doesn't mean that science has nothing to tell us about productive, well-adjusted, happy children, or children growing up to be productive, happy, well-adjusted adults. Science can tell us specifically, Hempel says, about how we might raise our children to better ensure that they end up being happy and well-adjusted and productive citizens. And he says that, and he suggests specifically that science can be of instrumental value in helping us determine what sort of parenting method is the best parenting method. Now, this is clearly a value judgment. How you raise your kids is a value-laden proposition. But Hempel suggests that, look, insofar as how you raise your children, insofar as the methods with which you raise your children are going to be helpful, a help or a hindrance in allowing your child to be well-adjusted, productive, and happy, and insofar as it's a categorical value to you for your children to be happy, well-adjusted, and productive, then you ought to look at science, in this case social science or psychology or social psychology, to help you determine how you ought to raise your kids. Hempel puts this in terms of repressive or permissive parenting styles, which I think is, both terms I think of which are sort of unfortunately loaded. But if you're, say you've got two different parenting styles and we'll call them repressive and permissive, Hempel says that if your categorical value is to raise kids that end up having certain kinds of character traits, happy and well-adjusted, then you ought to look to science to help you decide whether you're a permissive or repressive parent. And so this is a significant kind of value judgment that science can seem to help you make, presuming that you accept that that we can agree well enough on what constitutes being well-adjusted and happy and productive, and that we can agree on differences in parenting styles well enough to actually well enough to hold our terms fixed and do social science research on them. It does seem that social science research is relevant to how we raise our kids. But that's not because social science or any kind of science is telling us what we value. It's telling us how to get to what we value. It's instrumental and not categorical. Okay, now a third question that can be raised about values, again, is, are there any values assumed by the overall enterprise of science? So are there any values that are just inherently a part of science? Are there any values that are shared across all scientists? And there are sort of two categories of possible values that some people argue that either are as a matter of fact, shared values among scientists, or that some people argue ought to be understood as sort of founding value-based principles of science. And these can be divided, I've divided them here into an intrinsic category and a practical category. So some people argue, some scientists argue that part of the institution of science, built into the institution of science in various ways, is the value claim that knowledge is inherently worthwhile, that knowledge is worth pursuing in and of itself, that true justified belief is something we should want to have regardless of its usefulness or applicability, and that reason and objectivity are worthwhile goals. I think most scientists will acknowledge that almost no one is always purely objective. Almost no one operates purely on reason or is never irrational. But it's commonly argued that sort of baked into the enterprise of science is this idea that being reasonable, being a good reasoner, and being objective are worthwhile goals. They're sort of virtues for the scientist that scientists ought to seek. And then there's also not necessarily this isn't necessarily claimed by the same folks, but some people argue that science necessarily has practical values, and that part of the endeavor of science includes the idea that we ought to do our best to control our environment, and we ought to pursue avenues of research that will be broadly beneficial. So some people argue that it's not necessarily the case that science has or knowledge has intrinsic value, or that there's any intrinsic value in discovering knowledge, but that the values that should guide science should be more practical. The value that should guide science should be a desire to better the world. Okay. So now it's not clear that these two types of value claims are contradictory, but it's certainly consistent or inconsistent with each other. But it's certainly possible to favor one type of view over the other. Alternatively, it's possible to argue that there is no value claims built into society. Different scientists have different motivations for doing what they do, and there's nothing about the institution that particularly places any stress on any of these values over any other values. Okay, but this distinction, this distinction you can make in value claims between the idea that knowledge is worth pursuing in and of itself and the idea that science ought to be harnessed towards practical goals is especially relevant to our last question, the question of does a scientist have responsibility to consider possible applications of her research? Now, it's certainly the case that for most of us, particularly if we're non-scientists or if we're not science teachers, the most fundamental way that science affects our life, the most fundamental way that science affects our society is insofar as science allows for technology. Because certainly technology is an unavoidable part of society. It's an unavoidable part of our everyday lives. And I think that most people will agree that when it comes to technology, you take the good with the bad. There's sort of unfortunate applications of technology, and there's very laudable, very good applications of technology. And now a lot of, you'll occasionally see critiques, people who are skeptical of the value of science generally to society, people who are concerned that science isn't overall beneficial to society, that we maybe would be better off in some ways if we weren't so successful at science, if we didn't pursue science so doggedly. A lot of times these people are maybe more than being skeptical of science itself, they're skeptical of technology. They're skeptical of the role that technology plays in our lives. And so going back to our original question, if you accept, and not everyone accepts this, but if you accept that there are some bad applications of technology, that is, if you accept that some scientific research results in applications that can only do more harm to good in the world. If you accept this view, and again, not everyone does, but it's not a wildly implausible view, I think, and it's a view that a lot of people do defend. You're left with a question of, well, what does this mean? What does this say about the responsibilities, the moral responsibilities of a scientist? And here I think this distinction between practical values in science and intrinsic values of science comes to play. If you're someone who thinks that knowledge is intrinsically worthwhile and that part of the goal of science is just to learn more about the world, and that's a good in and of itself, I think you might be likely to say, look, I might, as a scientist, have responsibilities to avoid building things that I think are going to be more harmful than helpful. But I'm pursuing science because I want to know more about the world, and it's just worthwhile to know more about the world, and I shouldn't remain in ignorance about some interesting aspect of the world simply because I'm afraid that if I do research in this area, someone else might down the line build something terrible with this research I'm doing. So the person who says that science is primarily about science is primarily motivated by the intrinsic value of knowledge I think is probably likely to say that they aren't responsible for every possible application of their research because what they're doing is intrinsically worthwhile. Whereas someone who takes a more practical view of the role of science, of the value of science, might say that no, I mean, part of my responsibility as a scientist is to work on things that I think are going to be beneficial. And so in choosing between two areas of research, I should choose, regardless of which one I find sort of personally more interesting, I should choose the area of research that I think is going to be more likely to benefit humanity. Now, I think it's an interesting question, exactly which of these two types of views about science is more predominant. I think that frequently in presentations of their science, scientists tend to downplay the extent to which they're really operating on the intrinsic view that knowledge is just inherently worthwhile. I think if you look at the institution of science, it is the case that a lot of scientists in a lot of areas, sort of across the board, are interested in things just because they're interested in them. They're interested in things because there are open questions about the world that aren't answered, and that they don't really see any particular technological or practical application of their research. They're just interested in, what this certain breed of squid eats, or exactly how protein synthesis in this particular circumstance works, or just exactly whether or not there are any Earth-like planets in our galaxy. They're just interested in these questions, regardless of whether they have any practical consequences or not. And arguably, this is a value. This is a deep value, the idea that we ought to care about what the world is like. So these are any number of these are various ways in which values, general sort of broader questions, intersect with the sciences. But now we know that increasingly over the especially the course of this last century, and really over the course of the last several centuries, sciences have continually improved, continually increased the extent to which they can explain the world and the extent to which they can allow us control over our world. But I think it's worthwhile to remember that there are real limitations to the scientific method in terms of what it can do for us, in terms of what kinds of knowledge are available to us through scientific research. And these limitations include, for instance, one limitation that we've already talked about is that science aims to describe the world. Science aims to tell us what is in the world, what forces work in the world, what the world is like, and not tell us what we should value. So science seems to be unable to settle categorical questions of value, okay? Or what Hempel called categorical questions of value. We can't get fundamental moral principles from looking at the world or from the scientific method. So that's one limitation, not necessarily a disadvantage. Another limitation is that science is dependent on observable data. You need to have some way of observing some phenomena in order to apply the scientific method to it. There are parts of the universe that we can't know about through the scientific method, aspects of the universe that we can't know that are just unavailable to investigation through the scientific method. And finally, science can't give us perfect certainty. This is something that any scientist in any area, I think will say about their science. Now you don't want to go too far to this. I mean, in the ordinary sense of the term certainty, we're pretty certain about lots of scientific facts. I'm not about to go jump off a cliff. I'm pretty certain that the law of gravity and basic facts about physiology that science tells me are correct, and that I wouldn't make it if I did so. So in the ordinary sense of certainty, there's a lot of things that we can be pretty certain about through science. But there's nothing that science can't give us absolute certainty. Science doesn't prove anything. Science can demonstrate that certain hypotheses are very well confirmed. Science can give us very, very, very good reasons to believe something, but no scientist will tell you that science can give you absolute certainty about anything. And so that's a third and perhaps the most profound limitation of the scientific method, is that the scientific method doesn't allow certainty about anything. Now there's several types of knowledge that as this class goes forward, that we're going to talk about that are outside the scope of the scientific method. And this is this is the point at which we are sort of finished with our discussion of scientific ways of knowing, and we're going to move on to ways of knowing that are outside the scope of the scientific method. And these include and we're going to discuss 4 different types of knowledge, or at least possible types of knowledge. In some of these cases, with some of these categories, there's a matter of debate about whether you can even have these types of knowledge. So for instance, we're going to talk about aesthetic knowledge, knowledge about what art is about, what art is good or bad. So this is in particular an area where I think many people who've thought seriously about this topic, about the topic of art and the topic of the evaluation of art, deny that there's any such thing as aesthetic knowledge. That is, they deny that there's any such thing as true, justified beliefs about art, because there's simply no way that a belief about the value of art can be true or false. There's no way you can justify evaluative claims about art. But then there's others who argue that, properly understood, we can have knowledge about the value of art. In a very similar vein, moral knowledge. There's question here about whether you can be right or wrong about basic moral claims. Now, I think there's more. The group of serious investigators of this topic who believe that moral knowledge is impossible is somewhat smaller than the group that believes aesthetic knowledge is impossible, but it's still a serious and significant view. But on the other hand, there are many serious thinkers who believe that there is such a thing as moral knowledge, that we can know about the right things to do, that we can investigate in a serious and rigorous way what we ought to do, morally speaking. And in religious knowledge, I don't have to tell any of you that there's a matter of significant debate over what we can know through religion and how we know through religion, and we'll be taking that up in later lectures. And finally, mathematical knowledge. Now, mathematics is so closely tied and so important an instrument in all of the sciences, whether natural or social, that we often think of mathematics as part of the sciences. But mathematical knowledge is significantly different in some important ways from knowledge in the natural sciences and the social and behavioral sciences. Because mathematical knowledge, for one thing, does seem to be the clearest case of any form of knowledge in which we can have certainty. And mathematical knowledge, at least large portions of mathematical knowledge, significant portions of mathematical knowledge, are not empirical. They're not based on observation. They're based on proof. So we'll also be talking about that a little bit as this class goes on. So as we proceed in this class, these are 4 new areas of knowledge, 4 ways of knowing that are not ways of knowing in the sciences that I look forward to pursuing with you as this class goes on.